What if I told you the reason you struggle to start things isn't because you're lazy? It's because your brain is looking at the entire mountain, when you only need to take the first step. You open your laptop and think, okay, I have to finish this assignment. You look at the gym bag and think, I have to work out for an hour. You open that book and suddenly you're supposed to read 50 pages, remember everything, and somehow become a smarter person before dinner. And your brain basically goes, absolutely not. Let's check our phone instead. So here's a stupidly simple rule that can make starting almost anything easier. Give yourself 10 minutes. That's it. Not 10 minutes to finish. Not 10 minutes to become productive. 10 minutes to start. Because the problem with most things isn't actually doing them. It's crossing that invisible line between thinking about doing something and actually doing it. And once you understand that, procrastination starts looking a lot less mysterious. Think about the last time you had something important to do and kept putting it off. Maybe you had an email to write. Maybe your room was a disaster. Maybe you wanted to exercise. Maybe there was a project sitting on your computer that had been staring at you for 3 days. Every time you thought about it, you probably imagined the entire experience at once. First, I need to figure out what I'm doing. Then I need to organize everything. Then I need to spend a few hours working. Then I'll probably get stuck. Then I'll have to fix it. Then I'll finally finish. And just thinking about all of that feels exhausting before you've even started. Your brain isn't necessarily avoiding the task itself. It's avoiding the emotional weight you've attached to the task. So instead of saying, I have to clean my entire room, say, I'm going to clean for 10 minutes. Instead of, I have to study this entire chapter, say, I'm going to study for 10 minutes. Instead of, I need to write this whole project, say, I'm going to open the document and work for 10 minutes. You're not lowering your standards, you're lowering the entry fee. And this matters because starting and continuing are two different problems. Starting requires overcoming resistance. Continuing usually becomes much easier once you're already moving. It's like pushing a shopping cart that hasn't moved in a while. The first push feels strangely difficult, and then suddenly you're rolling around the supermarket, wondering why you bought 17 things you didn't need. Your brain works similarly. When you're sitting on the couch thinking about exercising, exercise feels like an event. Once you're already wearing your shoes and moving, it becomes something you're doing. When you're staring at a blank document, writing feels enormous. Once you've written 3 terrible sentences, you're no longer facing a blank document. You have something to work with. That's why the 10-minute rule isn't really about 10 minutes. It's about changing the question. Instead of asking, how do I finish this? You're asking, can I do this for 10 minutes? That's a much easier question to answer. And usually, the answer is yes. Here's how you actually use it. First, choose one thing you've been avoiding, not your entire life. One thing. Second, make the starting action ridiculously obvious. If you're studying, put the book on the desk and open to the page. If you're writing, open the document. If you're cleaning, pick up the first object. If you're exercising, put your shoes on. And third, set a timer for 10 minutes. Then, work until it ends. No negotiating with yourself halfway through. No checking whether you're suddenly in the mood. You already made the deal. And here's the important part. When the 10 minutes are over, you are allowed to stop. Seriously, this is where people accidentally ruin the whole idea. They hear 10-minute rule and immediately turn it into another productivity challenge. 10 minutes becomes 30. 30 becomes an hour. Then tomorrow they think, great, now I have to do another hour. And the resistance comes back. The point is to teach your brain that starting doesn't mean signing a legally binding contract with productivity. You can stop after 10 minutes. If you want to continue, great, keep going. If you don't, stop and come back later. Either way, you won. Because you practiced the behavior that actually matters, starting. And something interesting tends to happen when you do this repeatedly. 10 minutes often turns into more. Not because you forced yourself to continue, but because once you're moving, Continuing doesn't feel nearly as painful as starting did. You might sit down planning to read for 10 minutes and suddenly you're 20 pages in. You might tell yourself you'll clean for 10 minutes and realize you've already cleared half the room. You might open your project intending to write one paragraph and end up working for an hour. But don't make that expectation part of the rule. If you start expecting 10 minutes to magically become an hour every time, you've just rebuilt the pressure you were trying to remove. Some days you'll keep going. Some days you'll do exactly 10 minutes. Both count. This also works because it gives you evidence. Every time you tell yourself, "I'll do it later," you're reinforcing the idea that you're someone who doesn't start. Every time you start, even for 10 minutes, you're reinforcing the opposite. You're collecting evidence that you can act before you feel ready. And that's much more useful than waiting around for motivation. Because motivation is a terrible appointment keeper. Sometimes it shows up early. Sometimes it cancels. Sometimes it says it's 5 minutes away. And then you don't hear from it for 3 weeks. If your entire life depends on feeling motivated before you act, you're going to spend a lot of time waiting. The 10-minute rule doesn't require motivation. It requires a small commitment, and you can make that commitment even smaller by removing friction before you need to act. If you want to work out tomorrow morning, put your clothes somewhere visible tonight. If you want to study, leave the book open on your desk. If you want to write, leave the document ready. If you want to practice a skill, put the equipment where you can see it. The fewer decisions you have to make between thinking about something and starting it, the easier the start becomes. Because sometimes procrastination isn't a dramatic battle between discipline and laziness. Sometimes it's just 12 tiny annoying steps between you and the thing you want to do. Find the notebook. Find a pen. Open the laptop. Find the file. Remember the password. Get water. Check one notification. Suddenly you're watching a video about how people in Iceland pronounce volcano names. Make the first step boringly easy. And there's another reason this works. 10 minutes gives your brain permission to be bad. You don't have to write something brilliant for 10 minutes. You don't have to have an amazing workout. You don't have to clean perfectly. You don't have to understand every sentence you read. You just have to participate. That's important because perfectionism is procrastination wearing a nicer outfit. You tell yourself you're waiting until you can do something properly. But sometimes you're really just avoiding the uncomfortable feeling of being a beginner. 10 minutes lets you be terrible without making it a big deal. Write the bad paragraph. Read the confusing page. Do the awkward first workout. Make the ugly sketch. Start the messy room. You can improve something after it exists. You can't improve something you refuse to begin. And you can use the rule when a task feels emotionally heavy too. Maybe you've been avoiding sending a message because you don't know what to say. Give yourself 10 minutes to draft it. Maybe you've been avoiding making an appointment. Give yourself 10 minutes to find the number and make the call. Maybe you've been avoiding dealing with a pile of paperwork. Give yourself 10 minutes to sort the first few pages. The goal isn't to solve your entire life in 10-minute blocks. The goal is to stop treating every task like it requires you to solve your entire life before you can begin. So the next time you catch yourself saying, "I'll do it later," don't argue with yourself for 20 minutes. Don't create a complicated productivity system. Don't wait for the perfect playlist, the perfect morning, or the sudden appearance of your future disciplined self. Just say, 10 minutes. Open the thing. Start the thing. Give it 10 honest minutes. If you're still miserable when the timer ends, stop. If you're enjoying it, continue. If you made progress, come back tomorrow and do it again. Start small. Remove the friction. Let yourself be imperfect. And remember, the goal was never to become someone who can force themselves to work for 10 hours without stopping. The goal is to become someone who doesn't need to feel ready before taking action. Start the task. Give yourself 10 minutes. Let momentum do the rest. You don't need to finish everything today. You just need to begin.